Right. So for 1.4 day one notes, we're talking about absolute value and the distance and how we're to solve absolute value. So absolute value is the distance a number is from zero. Um, and distance is always positive. And the reason for that is, for example, here's my number 0. If I'm looking at the absolute value of -4, I'm looking for how far is -4 from 0. And well, it's 4 units away. And then my +4 is the same distance, 4 units away. So that's why we have two solutions sometimes. Let me write it down. So let's do an example and see how to solve absolute value equations, what steps to use and what they're going to look like. Let's say I have the absolute value of x minus 4 equal to 6. So for this problem, I want to see what x is. I'm trying to solve for x. And like we said, we could have two different answers, and we're going to try to make them make sense. We normally do about 3 steps, and we call them isolate, separate, and solve. So for my first step, step 1, we are going to isolate. And by isolate, we mean we want it to be by itself. And by it, we mean the absolute value. The absolute value has to be by itself, nothing outside of the absolute value. Since there's nothing outside of my absolute value other than the equal sign, we're good. That step is technically done for this problem. And then we move on to the next step. So for the next step, for step 2, we're going to separate into a positive side and a negative. I'm going to do negative on the left, positive on the right. And it's because on the number line, we can move 4 units either to the right side or to the left side. So we have 2 directions to move on. For the negative side, we're going to keep what was inside of the absolute value and make my other side negative, like that. For the positive side, we also keep what's inside of the absolute value, but leave the 6 positive. That's what's called positive side. And now we are ready to do my last step, which is to solve. Step 3 is to solve. Step 3 is to solve. To solve, you just draw the line and solve for x on both problems. So here I have a -4. I do the opposite and add 4. So I have x equals -2 plus 4 plus 4, and I have x equals 10. So again, I have 2 answers because I could have moved in either direction, either left or right. Now, to graph my answer, I'll have to sketch a number line, and I have a -2 on the left side, a +10 on the right side, and that's my answer. I'm going to do one more example that's a little bit different so that you can get comfortable with it. Let's say, for example, I have a fraction. I have the absolute value of x over 3 equal to 3. We're going to follow the same steps. The first step is to isolate. This one's already isolated, so you don't have to worry about that one. Step 1 is done. Step 1 is good to go. Step 2 is to separate. That one's very, very important. You need a negative side and a positive side. For my negative, keep x over 3. Actually, for both of them, keep x over 3. For the negative, make it -3 after the equal sign. For positive, make it +3. So that's step 2, and it's done. Step 3 is now to solve. You cannot solve until you finish step 2. Some people want to solve, and then they only end up with one answer. If you don't separate, you're going to end up with one answer. Now, the reason I wanted to go over this one is because I am dividing. It's x divided by 3. So if I want to get rid of that 3, if I want to solve, I have to do the opposite and multiply by a 3 on both sides. And that would give me -9. Whatever I do on that side, I'm going to do the same thing here because it's the same thing. I want to isolate my x, and I'm dividing by 3, and I get +9. So on my number line, my answers are from -9 and +9. Close circle on both. That's it. Just circles. Now for question 3, I want you to see how to isolate before I move on. Let's say, for example, I have 3x plus 9 minus 10 equal to -4. Notice to isolate, that means I need to get the absolute value by itself, but it's not by itself because I have this neighbor right here. So to isolate, I have to get rid of that -10. I do the opposite and add 10 to both sides. And I now have the absolute value of 3x plus 9 equal to 6. So that means it's isolated, And I'm done with step 1. My absolute value has no neighbor whatsoever. Now I can move on to step 2. Step 2 is to separate. Here is my negative side. Here's my positive side. 3x plus 9 equals negative 6. 3x plus 9 equals positive 6. Now we're going to solve them. Minus 9. 3x equals negative 15. Divide by 3. X equals negative 5. For the positive side, almost the same steps. We subtract the 9 from both sides. That means 3x equals negative 3. And then we divide by 3. That means equals negative 1. Notice I did not get the same number this time. Twice. So you will get different numbers sometimes. You just have to make sure you solve the problem correctly. On the left, I have negative 5. On the right, I have negative 1. There are my answers. Ooh. Now, you won't always have 2 solutions. For example, let's look at an example that won't have 2 solutions. Let's do example 4. And let's see why it won't have 2 solutions. If I have the absolute value of, let's say, 3x minus 1 equal to 0. Well, my first step is done. My absolute value is isolated. And then when I separate into my negative side, ooh, that's a highlighter. When I separate it into my negative side, I have 3x minus 1 equal 0. Can't have a negative 0. And for my positive side, it's the same thing. 3x minus 1 equals also positive 0. So it's the same problem. It's going to give me the same answer. I will get the same answer over there. So I only have one solution, and it's 1/3. And that's simply because I could not have a negative 0. So whenever your inequality is equal to 0, whenever your absolute value equals 0, we have one solution. All the other problems that we did were absolute value was equal to a positive number. We had 2 solutions. But there's also a third case, and I'm going to just squeeze it in here. What happens when my absolute value is equal to a negative number? Well, we run into an issue because remember, absolute value is distance. Can distance equal a negative number? Can we travel negative distance? Well, no. So this problem has no solution because absolute value is equal to a negative number, and that's not possible because we cannot travel negative distance. So those are the 3 cases you have to watch out for. I also want you to know the formula for the halfway point and the distance. So this is a very special one that we use for writing equations for distance because it's absolute value. We have absolute value of x minus the halfway point is equal to the distance to the halfway point. Distance to halfway point. So what does that even mean? Let's say that we have a cheer competition and the length of the routine is 4 minutes minimum and 5 minutes maximum. And then they ask us to write an equation that represents this. So let's look at what it looks like on my graph. I have 4 minutes minimum, 5 minutes maximum. So I have my answers. Now I have to come up with the equation that gave me these answers. So let's look at what I need for my equation. I need it to look like x minus a number equals a number. So this first number is the halfway point. The halfway point is literally what it says. It's the point between both numbers, both answers. So what is my point here in the middle between 4 and 5? And if you're not sure, then you do the distance formula. Distance I think that's what it's called. Anyways, it's when you add both numbers and then divide by 2. Always divide by 2. So it's 5 plus 4 divided, 5 plus 4 divided by 2. That's 9 divided by 2, or 4.5. And it makes sense. Between $4 and $5, I can have $4.50. So this is 4.5. That's my halfway point. Now, my distance to the halfway point is the distance between the halfway, that's why it's to the halfway point, and one of my endpoints. To find that, all you have to do is subtract. Big minus small, because distance cannot be negative. So what's 5 minus 4.5? And that might be a hard one to subtract on your head. You might want to try 4.5 to minus 4. It's going to give you the same number. In this case, it's 0.5. So that's my answer. That's how we write the equation when I know my answers firsthand.